On October 26, 1962, the 1st Foreign Regiment left Sidi Bel Abbès. The regiment was not retreating from a battlefield. No enemy column was entering its barracks. Its soldiers had not surrendered their weapons. But something nearly as profound was happening. A place that had been associated with the French Foreign Legion for more than a century was about to cease being its home. The Legion had already begun packing its museum. Its war memorial was dismantled so that it could be rebuilt on the other side of the Mediterranean. The 1st Foreign Regiment itself was transferred to Aubagne in southern France, where an institution created for service overseas would establish a permanent headquarters in Metropolitan, France for the first time in its long Algerian story. Yet the Legion was not abolished. One of its most famous regiments had already been destroyed after joining a rebellion against the French government. Another would remain in Algeria for years before moving to Corsica. Others would be scattered toward Djibouti and France's remaining overseas territories. The Legion survived, but the Legion that emerged from Algeria would never again be quite the same institution that had entered it. To understand why 1962 mattered so deeply, it's necessary to understand one distinction. Algeria was not simply another campaign in Foreign Legion history. It was where much of the Legion had become itself. King Louis-Philippe created the Foreign Legion in 1831. During the early French conquest of Algeria, the institution was designed to incorporate foreign volunteers into French military service, allowing France to use men of many nationalities under French command. Its first fighting in Algeria followed almost immediately. By 1840, Legion troops were establishing themselves at Sidi Bel Abbès, southwest of Oran. Over succeeding decades, the settlement developed into the institution's symbolic center. The relationship eventually went far beyond barracks. Sidi Bel Abbès became the Legion's maison mère, its mother house. Administration, training traditions, ceremonial life, archives, memorials, and institutional mythology accumulated there. The Foreign Legion Museum was established there in the 20th century. Its dead were commemorated there. Generations of recruits passed through a culture in which North African landscapes were not foreign scenery, but part of the organization's memory. That history also explains why the Legion cannot accurately be described as a private mercenary army. Legionnaires were foreign volunteers, but they served France within the French army. The modern Legion still defines the legionnaire as a volunteer serving France, and historically that distinction mattered enormously. Paris could deploy the force, reorganize it, dissolve its units, and punish officers who disobeyed civilian authority. By the 1950s, the Legion had also acquired an extraordinary combat reputation. Its units had fought through 2 world wars, Morocco, Syria, and Indochina. Foreign parachute battalions had suffered catastrophic losses in Southeast Asia, including at Route Coloniale 4 and Dien Bien Phu, and were rebuilt afterward in Algeria. These experiences strengthened an internal culture built around endurance, regimental loyalty, remembrance of the dead, and the belief that units could be destroyed physically and still be recreated. Then came another colonial war. Beginning in 1954, the National Liberation Front, the FLN, fought to end French rule in Algeria. For the Legion, therefore, the conflict threatened more than another possession of the French Empire. It threatened the ground beneath its own institutional home, and that would create a dangerous problem when the French government eventually decided that military loyalty meant accepting a political outcome that many soldiers regarded as abandonment. The Algerian War began in November 1954, only months after France's defeat at Dien Bien Phu. For professional soldiers who had fought in Indochina, the timing mattered. They had watched one colonial war end in withdrawal. Now many were being sent directly into another. The Legion became heavily involved in operations against the FLN and its military wing. Its infantry, cavalry, Saharan, and parachute formations operated across Algeria. The 1st and 2nd Foreign Parachute regiments emerged as especially prominent combat units. According to the Legion's own retrospective, nearly 2,000 legionnaires were killed during the Algerian conflict, but battlefield effectiveness could not answer the underlying political question. France had to decide whether Algeria would remain French indefinitely, whether it would receive some new constitutional relationship with France, or whether its population would eventually determine its own political future. That question destabilized the French Republic itself. In May 1958, amid the Algerian crisis and pressure from military and European settlers, settler, circles demanding a government committed to maintaining French Algeria. Charles de Gaulle returned to power. He became the central political figure of the new Fifth Republic. Many supporters of Algerie Française initially believed his return would protect their cause. Instead, de Gaulle gradually moved in another direction. On September 16, 1959, he publicly embraced the principle of Algerian self-determination. A referendum followed in January 1961, giving him broad support in metropolitan France for that policy. Negotiations with the Algerian independence movement increasingly appeared unavoidable. For some officers, particularly men shaped by Indochina, this looked less like statesmanship than repetition. They believed the French army had gained the military initiative in Algeria, only to see political leaders prepare to relinquish the territory anyway. They also worried about Europeans in Algeria, and especially Muslim Algerians who had served France as soldiers, auxiliaries, administrators, or informants. The most famous Legion officer caught in this crisis was Major Élie Denois de Saint-Marc. Saint-Marc had served in the resistance during the Second World War, survived Buchenwald, fought in Indochina, and later joined the Legion's airborne forces. His experiences in Indochina included the withdrawal from areas where local allies were left behind. He later connected that memory to his fear that France would abandon the Algerians who had supported it. That did not make rebellion legal, but it helps explain why the crisis became so personal inside parts of the professional army. By early 1961, there were therefore two forms of loyalty pulling against one another. One was loyalty to comrades, units, local allies, and the belief that French sacrifices in Algeria had created obligations that could not simply be negotiated away. The other was the constitutional obligation of soldiers to obey the government of France. In April, that contradiction exploded. Four senior generals, Maurice Challe, Edmond Jouot, Raoul Salon, and André Zeller, became associated with an attempt to overturn de Gaulle's Algerian policy. Their objective was to prevent the political abandonment of French Algeria. The conspirators needed troops capable of moving quickly, and one of the units placed at the center of the operation was the Legion's 1st Foreign Parachute Regiment. That decision would destroy the regiment before Algeria itself became independent. During the night of April 21, 1961, forces supporting the general's putsch moved against key positions in Algiers. Major Élie de Saint-Marc was temporarily commanding the Berger REP because its colonel was absent. He committed the regiment to the rebellion. The elite formation helped secure important points in the city, while the insurgent generals attempted to extend their authority across Algeria and persuade the rest of the armed forces to join them. But the French army did not move as a single body. Many commanders remained loyal to Paris. Others hesitated. Conscripts were particularly important because the putschists could not assume that soldiers performing compulsory service would follow rebellious professional officers. De Gaulle appealed directly to the armed forces and the French population. Within days, the attempt collapsed. The consequences for the 1st REP were immediate. On April 30, 1961, the regiment was dissolved. Its legionnaires did not all become criminals. Men were reassigned. Responsibility fell especially heavily on the officers who had taken the unit into rebellion. Saint-Marc surrendered, was tried, and received a 10-year prison sentence. He ultimately served about 5 years before being released in December 1966. His civil and military rights were later restored. This distinction is essential. The French government did not conclude that the entire Foreign Legion was politically unreliable. It destroyed the regiment that had openly rebelled. The rest of the Legion continued serving. That decision probably tells us more about the institution's future than the putsch itself. The government still believed it needed foreign professional troops, but the political lesson was unmistakable. Regimental identity could never outrank the authority of the state. Meanwhile, negotiations over Algeria accelerated. France and the FLN eventually concluded. The Evian Accords on March 18, 1962, a ceasefire formally came into effect the following day. Though violence did not simply stop, the agreements established the process through which Algeria would move toward independence. For the Foreign Legion, the geographical implications were enormous. In March 1962, according to the Legion's own historical review, virtually the entire institution was deployed in Algeria and the Sahara. The notable exception was a Legion battalion in Madagascar. The Re, 2C REI, 3C REI, 4 REI, 5 REI, 13e des Bleus, 2e Rep, cavalry formations, and Saharan units were still spread across the territory. Now that network had to be dismantled or relocated. The process began even before formal independence. On April 5, 1962, the Legion inspector announced that the first departing unit was heading toward Djibouti and that others would follow toward new territories. Then came Sidi Bel Abbès. During October, the museum was packed. The great memorial erected there in 1931 was dismantled for reconstruction in Provence. On October 26th, the first foreign regiment completed its transfer to Aubagne. The Legion had survived the fall of French Algeria. Its Algerian world had not. What happened next was unusual, because the Legion had not suffered. The fate normally associated with a defeated army. Its soldiers were not collectively taken prisoner. They were not stripped of rank by a victorious foreign government. Their pensions did not vanish because their state had ceased to exist. France still existed. The French army still existed. The Legion remained part of it. So the immediate aftermath was an institutional migration, not a military annihilation. That made the loss easier administratively and in some ways harder psychologically. Legionnaire whose unit received orders to France or Djibouti still had his profession. He still had his chain of command and contract. Yet the physical world around which generations of Legion identity had been organized was being broken apart. Sidi Bel Abbès offers the clearest example. The Legion did not simply abandon its objects. It transplanted them. The museum collection went to France. The war memorial was reassembled at Aubagne. The new museum, whose first stone was laid in 1963, opened during Cameroon commemorations in 1966. Even monuments brought from elsewhere in Algeria were incorporated into the new complex. This was an extraordinarily deliberate act of institutional continuity. The message was almost architectural. Algeria might be lost, but the historical chain was not going to be broken. There was another reason for discipline. The final months of French Algeria were chaotic and violent. The ceasefire did not create immediate peace. The Organisation Armée Secrète, or OAS, fought violently against Algerian independence and against the policies of de Gaulle. FLN violence also continued in different forms. While Europeans fled Algeria in enormous numbers, and Muslim Algerians who had served, France faced an increasingly dangerous future. For the Legion, this mattered because the memories of local allies had already played a role in the 1961 revolt. But the position of an ordinary legionnaire and that of a harki were fundamentally different. The legionnaire was a member of a surviving French military institution and could be transferred with it. A harki was an Algerian auxiliary whose future depended upon decisions about demobilization, protection, evacuation, and acceptance in France. A later official French report acknowledged the disastrous consequences that followed for many former auxiliaries and their families, including imprisonment, reprisals, and killings after independence. Estimates of the number killed remain disputed and vary widely, which is why responsible accounts should avoid presenting a single figure as certain. This is important because later, Legion memory sometimes merges several different losses into one emotional story. Algeria comrades killed during the war, Europeans who fled, and Algerian allies who were abandoned. Historically, those groups experienced very different outcomes. For the Legion itself, the government's solution was reorganization. Some units were dissolved, some were reduced or consolidated, some moved immediately overseas. Others remained temporarily at French facilities in Algeria under the arrangements that followed independence. This meant the departure was not a single dramatic evacuation in July 1962. It unfolded over several years. The 2E Rep, for example, remained at Bousfer in Algeria after independence. The 1st Foreign Cavalry Regiment also spent part of the post-war period around Mers-el-Kébir before eventually moving to metropolitan France in 1967. Elements connected with French installations in the Sahara remained longer still. Meanwhile, Aubagne began taking over the function Sidi Bel Abbès had once performed. The change was more than geographical. The Legion was being pulled closer to metropolitan France, closer to the administrative center of the French army, and farther from the semi-separate colonial environment in which its culture had matured. Its next challenge was therefore not merely finding new barracks. France had to decide what the Foreign Legion was for in a world where the empire that had created so much demand for it was disappearing. This was an extraordinarily deliberate act of institutional continuity. The message was almost architectural. Algeria might be lost, but the historical chain was not going to be broken. There was another reason for discipline. The final months of French Algeria were chaotic and violent. The ceasefire did not create immediate peace. The Organisation Armée Secrète, or OAS, fought violently against Algerian independence and against the policies of de Gaulle. FLN violence also continued in different forms. While Europeans fled Algeria in enormous numbers, and Muslim Algerians who had served, France faced an increasingly dangerous future. For the Legion, this mattered because the memories of local allies had already played a role in the 1961 revolt. But the position of an ordinary legionnaire and that of a harki were fundamentally different. The legionnaire was a member of a surviving French military institution and could be transferred with it. A harki was an Algerian auxiliary whose future depended upon decisions about demobilization, protection, evacuation, and acceptance in France. A later official French report acknowledged the disastrous consequences that followed for many former auxiliaries and their families, including imprisonment, reprisals, and killings after independence. Estimates of the number killed remain disputed and vary widely, which is why responsible accounts should avoid presenting a single figure as certain. This is important because later, Legion memory sometimes merges several different losses into one emotional story. Algeria comrades killed during the war, Europeans who fled, and Algerian allies who were abandoned. Historically, those groups experienced very different outcomes. For the Legion itself, the government's solution was reorganization. Some units were dissolved, some were reduced or consolidated, some moved immediately overseas. Others remained temporarily at French facilities in Algeria under the arrangements that followed independence. This meant the departure was not a single dramatic evacuation in July 1962. It unfolded over several years. The 2E Rep, for example, remained at Bousfer in Algeria after independence. The 1st Foreign Cavalry Regiment also spent part of the post-war period around Mers-el-Kébir before eventually moving to metropolitan France in 1967. Elements connected with French installations in the Sahara remained longer still. Meanwhile, Aubagne began taking over the function Sidi Bel Abbès had once performed. The change was more than geographical. The Legion was being pulled closer to metropolitan France, closer to the administrative center of the French army, and farther from the semi-separate colonial environment in which its culture had matured. Its next challenge was therefore not merely finding new barracks. France had to decide what the Foreign Legion was for in a world where the empire that had created so much demand for it was disappearing. The answer would turn the Legion from a predominantly colonial garrison force into something closer to a permanently available expeditionary reserve. The men who paid for the putsch. For Élie de Saint-Marc, the end of French Algeria began behind prison walls. His choice in April 1961 ended his active military career. He was sentenced to 10 years and imprisoned at Toul. De Gaulle eventually pardoned him, and he was released on Christmas Day, 1966. His rights were restored in 1978. Decades later, he became a public author and speaker and received the Grand Cross of the Legion of Honor in 2011. St. Mark, therefore, followed perhaps the most dramatic survivor path. Decorated soldier, rebel officer, prisoner, civilian, and eventually a partially rehabilitated figure in French public memory. But his story can also distort the larger picture if treated as typical. Most legionnaires did not rebel against the government. Most did not join underground organizations. And the Legion as an institution did not disappear with the Foreign Rep. That brings us to the second path. The legionnaires who simply changed regiments. When a military unit is dissolved, the men inside it do not necessarily vanish with the badge. Legionnaires from formations that disappeared could be reassigned. According to the requirements of the army, the uniform remained. The contract remained. What disappeared was the particular community represented by a regimental number, who barracks, a commander, and a collection of shared memories. For an institution in which regimental tradition carried enormous emotional weight, that distinction mattered. The destruction of the withdrew therefore functioned simultaneously as punishment and warning. The Legion could preserve traditions. It could not preserve political autonomy. After 1961, the surviving 2E RAP became the Legion's sole parachute regiment. It had not suffered the institutional death imposed on its counterpart. In 1962, it settled at Beauce-Fair, where Colonel Pierre Caillaude developed the specialization of its companies, a feature that would remain associated with the regiment later. Then in 1967 came another departure. The 2E Rep left Algeria and moved to Calvi in Corsica. The arrival was not entirely smooth. Later, Legion accounts recalled friction between the newly arrived soldiers and parts of the local population, but the relationship changed over time. Calvi became inseparable from the regiment, just as other French towns would develop long associations with relocated Legion formations. The transition reveals something crucial. The Legion did not replace Sidi Bel Abbès with a single new Sidi Bel Abbès. It created several smaller centers of identity. Aubagne became the institutional headquarters. Calvi became the home of the paratroopers. Other formations developed permanent relationships with other French or overseas garrisons. The old centralized North African world became a network. The men sent farther overseas. Not every unit returned to France. The 13th Demi Brigade of the Foreign Legion followed a different route. The 13E DBLE had one of the most distinguished histories in the French army, including service with the Free French during the Second World War and later combat in Indochina and Algeria. In 1962, it left Algeria for French Somaliland, the territory that later became Djibouti. The movement began in the spring. The unit's colors arrived later that year, and its companies were dispersed among posts in the territory. Instead of conducting counterinsurgency in Algeria, legionnaires again became garrison troops, builders, patrol soldiers, and a French military presence at a strategically important position near the Red Sea. This was the third survivor path, imperial contraction without complete overseas withdrawal. France had lost Indochina and was losing most of its African empire, but it retained overseas departments, territories, bases, defense agreements, and relationships with newly independent states. The Legion could be fitted into that new system. The institution's official history describes the post-1962 Legion as based in metropolitan France, while also maintaining a presence in places including French Guiana, Mayotte, Polynesia, and Djibouti at different periods. That was a very different geographical pattern from the old colonial Legion. Instead of thousands of men tied permanently to the conquest and policing of one enormous North African possession, units could be stationed across distant strategic points and moved when French policy required them. In other words, losing Algeria made mobility more important. The last legionnaires still in Algeria. There is also an overlooked fourth path. Some Legion units did not leave Algeria in 1962. This complicates the common image of one final ship carrying the entire force away. France retained temporary military rights and installations after independence, and Legion units continued serving at some of them. The 2E Rep remained at Beauce-Fair until 1967. The Werrec regrouped around Mers el-Kebir before relocating to Orange in October 1967. Some Legion elements linked to Saharan deployments remained later still. For these soldiers, the strange consequence of independence was that they could still wake up in Algeria while knowing that the Algeria of their institution had already ceased to exist. They were now foreign troops stationed by agreement in a sovereign Algerian state. That was a profound reversal. The Legion had been created during French conquest. Now its remaining units were preparing to leave territory whose sovereignty France had recognized. By the end of the decade, that chapter was effectively closed. The men who built a new home in France. At Aubagne, meanwhile, Colonel Alberic Vaillant and the 1st Foreign Regiment faced the most symbolic task task of all, making an unfamiliar camp feel like institutional continuity rather than exile. The Legion's monuments helped. The bronze globe of the Sidi Bel Abbès Memorial was reconstructed. The museum eventually reopened. Cameroon, the annual commemoration of the Legion's famous 1863 battle in Mexico, continued to function as the central ritual, linking current legionnaires to their dead predecessors. This matters because military institutions survive through more than manpower tables. They survive through repeated ceremonies, vocabulary, symbols, songs, archives, flags, cemeteries, uniforms, and stories that teach the next recruit who came before him. The Legion understood that instinctively. It therefore transported memory as carefully as it transported equipment. Sidi Bel Abbès could no longer be French, but its ritual function could be reconstructed in Provence, from colonial garrisons to intervention forces. The final path belonged not to particular men, but to the institution itself. Once the Legion had been redistributed, it began accumulating a new kind of combat history. The 2E rep became one of the clearest symbols of this transformation. After moving to Corsica in 1967, the regiment was repeatedly used for overseas interventions. The Legion records deployments by its parachutists in Chad, Djibouti, Lebanon, Central Africa, Afghanistan, Mali, and other theaters. The most famous early demonstration came at Kolwezi in Zaire in May 1978. French authorities sent the 2E REP during a crisis in the mining city after rebels seized. The area and civilians were threatened. Legion paratroopers conducted an airborne intervention that became one of the defining operations of the post-Algerian Legion. The importance of Kolwezi was larger than the battle itself. 16 years after Algeria became independent, the Foreign Legion was demonstrating why Paris had preserved it. This was no longer primarily a force holding down a permanent colonial frontier. It could be kept in France, transported rapidly, dropped into a distant crisis, accomplish a limited mission, and leave. The political purpose had changed. The institutional culture had not disappeared. And this combination, old identity, new strategic function, was the real secret of the Legion's survival. So did the French Foreign Legion that had existed before 1962 actually disappear? In one sense, yes. The territorial system that produced it was dismantled. Sidi Bel Abbès ceased to be the mother house. Algeria stopped being the geographical center of Legion life. The old network of North African garrisons disappeared. The colonial wars that had shaped generations of legionnaires were ending. Even the relationship between military, professionalism, and politics had been violently clarified by the Poch. No regiment could claim that its interpretation of honor entitled it to overturn the constitutional government. But in another sense, the Legion preserved an extraordinary amount. The 1st Foreign Regiment survived. The 2E Rep survived. The 13E DBL survived. Older battle honors, memorial rituals, songs, uniforms, regimental colors, and the mythology of Cameroon remained powerful. Urban did not attempt to erase Sidi Bel Abbès. It recreated pieces of it. The Foreign Legion Museum itself describes the 1962 move as the transfer of the maison, mère from Sidi Bel Abbès to Aubagne. That language is revealing. The institution imagined itself not as newly founded, but transplanted. This is also where popular mythology needs correction. One version of the story presents 1962 as France betraying an undefeated Legion and driving it from its homeland. That captures a genuine feeling remembered by some legionnaires, but historically it is incomplete. The Foreign Legion was part of the French army, not an independent political actor. Algeria's future was decided by the French state. Negotiations with Algerian nationalists, referendums, and eventually Algerian sovereignty, not by whether one particular military formation believed it had performed effectively in the field. The opposite myth is also misleading, that decolonization made the Legion obsolete. It did not. France still wanted professional troops capable of rapid deployment abroad. The official history of the Legion describes a force operating after 1962 from metropolitan France and remaining active across French overseas territories and external operations. What changed was the logic of deployment. The colonial Legion had often occupied territory for years or decades. The post-colonial Legion increasingly trained to move between crises. overseas. That change can be followed geographically. Sidi Bel Abbès gave way to Oban. Bousfer gave way to Calvi. The 13e DBLE left Algeria for Djibouti. Other units built new relationships with French towns and overseas bases. The Legion had lost one enormous territorial home and replaced it with a dispersed system connected directly to the modern French state. And Algeria never entirely disappeared from Legion memory. It remained in cemeteries, monuments, campaign honors, institutional histories, veterans associations, songs, and the biographies of the men who had fought there. That memory is complicated. It includes military courage and sacrifice. It also belongs to a colonial war marked by terrorism, repression, torture, civilian suffering, political rebellion, displacement, and deep disagreements over what France owed both the European settlers and Algerians who had fought on its side. A historically serious account has to hold those realities together. The Legion survived Algeria precisely because it eventually separated its identity from the political project of keeping Algeria French. The Bernard Ripie had crossed that boundary in 1961. It disappeared. The wider Legion stepped back from it and endured. France's departure from Algeria did not destroy the French Foreign Legion. It destroyed the world in which the Legion had spent more than a century becoming famous. One regiment rebelled and was dissolved. Some of its officers went to prison. Other legionnaires were reassigned. Entire formations crossed the Mediterranean or moved to new overseas garrisons. The 2ERAP eventually rebuilt its future in Corsica. The 13e DBLA began a new chapter in Djibouti. And at Oban, the 1st Foreign Regiment reconstructed not only a headquarters, but a physical archive of the life it had left behind. That was the real transformation. The Legion stopped being an institution whose center of gravity lay inside the French colonial empire and became a mobile component of France's post-colonial armed forces. Its homeland disappeared from the map, so it carried the homeland with it. And perhaps that raises the most interesting question of all. When a military tradition survives after the political world that created it has vanished, is it still the same institution, or has it become something entirely new? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you enjoy discovering what happened to famous soldiers, armies, and military orders after their old world ended, subscribe to After the Sword.